Close that book up. I just heard it start.
Good timing. Wow, that's right. Started now, yes. Okay. Right. Good morning, everyone. Mask, just check. Check. I think that's working now. Yeah, I think we're good. No, you can. Oh, got it. All right. Oh, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to Yale Cardiology Grand Rounds today. We have the distinct honor of having Professor Lance Gravely speak to us today. He is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Florida, with affiliate appointments in African American Studies, the Center for Latin American Studies, and the Center for the Study of Race and Race Relations. His research aims to explain and address the health consequences of systemic racism with a focus on hypertension in the African diaspora. He takes a critical biocultural approach, drawing on theory and methods from the social and biological sciences. He is the former editor of Medical Anthropology Quarterly, the former associate editor of Field Methods, the co-founder of Health Equity Alliance of Tallahassee, or HEAT, and the co-editor of the second edition of the Handbook of Methods in Cultural Anthropology. His work has appeared in a wide range of scholarly journals, including American Anthropologist, American Journal of Public Health, Annual Review of Anthropology, American Journal of Human Biology, Culture, Medicine, and Psychiatry, Field Methods, and more. Beyond his work at the University of Florida, he maintains a consulting practice specializing in mixed methods research and the analysis of qualitative data. He is also an FAA certified commercial multi-engine instrument rated pilot and flight instructor, which I think is very cool. So, without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Lance. I think we're all really in for a treat to hear what he has to say. I've heard him speak twice before, once because I invited him to speak for our program for biomedical ethics at Yale. And he's really doing some very important work, and we're really lucky to have him here today. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate that warm introduction. And that's definitely the first time anybody's mentioned my flying at one of these things. So thank you all for being here, whether you're here in person or joining us online. Sarah, thank you very much for this opportunity to visit. I'd like to thank the whole department and section on cardiovascular medicine for this chance to speak to you, coming from my perspective as an anthropologist, but one who from the very start has been motivated by trying to be in conversation with clinicians with the goal of trying to improve our understanding of race and racism and move toward health equity. So I want to frame my comments with this cover from Scientific American nearly 20 years ago now, where they pose this question that has really remarkable staying power. Does race exist? For most of the 20th century, the consensus among anthropologists and population geneticists was resounding no. And this century, as we've learned more about the structure of human genetic variation, the evidence against race has only grown stronger. But that doesn't mean, of course, that race has gone away, particularly in medicine, where casual assumptions about differential susceptibility to disease among racially defined groups remains common. Sometimes those assumptions are made explicit, as in a study published in the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology about racial inequalities in preterm birth. It was picked up in the New York Times and lots of other places. And the headline takeaway message from this study and the media coverage of it seems to confirm what everybody knows, that race captures something intrinsic about our biology. This example also reveals some of the difficulties with the science, because the study on which this New York Times report was based actually included no genetic data. And that's not as rare as it ought to be. In the last couple of years, with greater attention to racial inequalities in the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen similar ideas reach a broad audience. For example, in an April 7th, 2020 interview, early on in the pandemic, Louisiana Senator Bill Cassidy, who is also a physician, speculated that his African-American constituents were at higher risk of death from COVID-19 because of unspecified genetic reasons. Now, other times, the assumptions about race and genes and disease are not as explicit. They can be more subtle. For example, if we consider the JNC8 guidelines for management of hypertension, JNC8 recommends, as earlier iterations of this guidance did as well, that the physician's perception of a patient's race, particularly whether they are, in the words of the JNC report, part of the general non-Black population or the general Black population, that perception ought to change the choice of an antihypertensive therapy. Now, before we get too deep into the weeds about any of these particular issues, I just want to back up to this question that really underlies all of those issues, which is, does race exist? We're talking about race. What exactly is it, and how does it exist? And to frame my talk, I want to point out that a lot of the debate falters on the fact that this is not just one question, but it's multiple. And depending on which question that you see there and how you interpret it, it shapes the direction for research and understanding of the pattern of racialized health inequities. The implicit question that Scientific American wants us thinking about here is, to what extent does race capture intrinsic biological divisions in our species? So, for example, to what extent does race capture genetic differences that confer susceptibility to disease outcomes, response to pharmacotherapy, or other meaningful outcomes? So this question is important, but it's incomplete, because we should also be thinking, in what ways does race exist as a political, economic, and social structure that has force in people's lives, and indeed that has biological consequences? And keeping these two different interpretations of this question separate is tremendously important for public health, medical research, and practice. So these problems provide the context for the work that I'll share today. And along the way, I will address three key ideas. The first is that race is a poor proxy for the structure of human genetic variation. When we try to understand human genetics, including genetic susceptibility to disease, through the lens of race, we are likely to get it wrong. It's simply bad science. Good science and clinical practice depend on taking seriously the second idea, that racism has biological consequences. And the empirical work that I'll share joins a growing body of evidence documenting how racism shapes the environment in which we are born, grow, develop, and age. This work points to the primacy of social context for achieving health equity. Last, we must be on guard against false assumptions about race, genes, and disease. These assumptions are deep-rooted in American society and in the history of American medicine, because many people falsely assume that race maps onto genetic differences, health inequities among racially defined groups. What I refer to here as the embodied consequences of racism are often interpreted as evidence of intrinsic, inherited biological differences. This kind of circular reasoning corrupts scientific and clinical practice and causes measurable harm, for example, in the use of race in medical algorithms that shape whether people receive the standard of care. So I'll take up these ideas in the context of my work on what some have referred to as the puzzle of hypertension in African Americans. And the first piece of this puzzle, as you all well know, is that throughout the African diaspora, people of recent African descent tend to have higher average blood pressures and higher rates of hypertension than do others in the same societies. And this pattern is best documented in the United States, where NHANES shows that hypertension is almost 50% more common among Black Americans than it is among whites, affecting roughly 4 of every 10 African Americans. Trends toward higher average blood pressure have been noted in other populations in the African diaspora, including in Britain, Brazil, Bolivia, many parts of the Caribbean. As a rule, the burden of high blood pressure is not as great in other African-derived populations as it is in the US, but a pattern of elevated blood pressure has been documented nonetheless. And this pattern is significant, first of all, because of its devastating impact. I certainly don't have to tell this audience that, but as a major cause of heart disease and kidney failure and stroke, high blood pressure accounts for roughly 15% of the Black-white inequalities and potential life years lost, which is more than any other single cause, including diabetes, cancer, HIV/AIDS, homicide. Hypertension also takes a toll in Latin America and the Caribbean, where heart disease, stroke, and kidney failure are among the leading causes of death. So that's the first reason that this puzzle demands our attention. The second is that generations of attempts to solve this puzzle have assumed that some intrinsic racial difference is at the root of the problem. And this assumption is reflected even in the language of many reports in the biomedical literature. So take, for example, this 1981 paper in Postgraduate Medical Journal. Is blood pressure different in Black people? Or 15 years later in the Journal of Human Hypertension, the same question, slightly different words. Is the pathogenesis of hypertension different in Black patients? Or perhaps more tellingly, this paper from the Journal of Hypertension in 2000, which implies that the only open question is which genetic factor is responsible for excess hypertension in people of African descent, not whether it is primarily a genetic answer. These ideas carry into more recent literature. For example, here's a review article from about a decade ago in Current Opinions in Nephrology and Hypertension. And the review concedes at that point, but I think it's a fair way to characterize the state of the science today, that the genetic basis of essential hypertension remains largely unknown. We found a few dozen SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, that contribute risk to essential hypertension, but altogether, they don't account for more than about 3.5% of the variation in blood pressure. So one of the main takeaway messages of this review, which I think holds today, is that we don't really understand the genetic basis of essential hypertension that well. And yet at the same time, these authors remain willing to assert that racial inequalities in hypertension pathophysiology are largely genetic in origin. They write that relative to European Americans, African Americans more often manifest salt sensitivity with expanded plasma volume and suppressed plasma renin activity, non-dipping phenotypes, albuminuria, and end-stage renal disease. These factors support an inherited basis for disease. Well, the first flaw here, of course, is that the researchers have inferred a genetic cause based only on differences in phenotype. And we've known, at least since Mendel, that such inferences are unwarranted, even for traits as simple as the height or color of garden peas, much less for complex phenotypes like blood pressure. It very much remains an open question to what extent the phenotypic differences these authors observe are attributable to genes, to environments, or to complex interactions between them. The other thing that we ought to pay attention to here is the ease with which people are classified into these two groups of European Americans and African Americans, as if they are categorical differences between types of people, with the implication that it fits into some kind of universal typology of human difference. And here we might then look beyond the US and the racial distinctions that we're used to here to think about the work of Richard Cooper and colleagues who have looked at the prevalence of hypertension across a wide range of societies, which here I will note as some that are racialized as white and others that are racialized as Black. So if we look at the bottom, 3 samples from Nigeria, Jamaica, and people racialized as Black in the US, you can see already wide variation in the age-adjusted prevalence of hypertension. This is, at a minimum, a clue to the importance of social environment, that we're not just talking about intrinsic biology. But more than that, it should make us question the emphasis on excess hypertension in the African diaspora, because if you look at comparable studies, particularly from Europe, other populations that would be racialized as white, we can see actually much higher prevalence of age-adjusted hypertension, which raises the question about why the particular focus on hypertension in populations of African ancestry, if in fact we can see that populations racialized as white exhibit even greater risk of hypertension. And we can also turn to the direct genetic evidence. And the direct genetic evidence undermines the assumption that genes have much to do with it at all. So for example, in a systematic review of research on cardiovascular disease, Kaufman and colleagues showed that the incredible effort that has been spent trying to find the genetic basis of racial inequalities in cardiovascular disease has turned up very little. They say that despite the rapid increase in the number of genomic studies over the past decade covering many outcomes, the accumulated evidence for a genetic contribution to cardiovascular disease disparities in Blacks versus whites has been essentially nil. So with this framing in place, I want to turn to 3 empirical examples from work my collaborators and I have done. And it first picks up with a study done out of Neil Rish's lab, led by Wateng, published in the Journal of Human Genetics, which exhibits some of the unwarranted assumptions that I've just been discussing. In this study, the goal was to test for associations between individual level estimates of genetic ancestry, described here as racial admixture, and 2 health outcomes, BMI and blood pressure, in African Americans and Mexican Americans in the Family Blood Pressure Program study. The researchers conclude that their results are suggestive of genetic differences between Africans and non-Africans that influence blood pressure, but that such effects are likely to be modest compared to environmental ones. Well, I think we can say with confidence that the second part of this sentence is correct, but the first part is not for 2 reasons. The first, most surprising reason is that the study actually provided no statistically significant evidence of an association between African genetic ancestry and blood pressure. So the claim that it was suggestive of such differences clearly reaches beyond the available data. But this study also exhibits a conceptual problem that is more common and arguably more detrimental to our understanding of these patterns. The setup for the study was to examine the association between genetic ancestry and blood pressure, 2 clearly biological parameters. And if the researchers observed an association, their assumption was that the mechanism was some susceptibility alleles that were both more common among people of African ancestry and that increased the likelihood of high blood pressure. But in this study, they did not have specific genetic variants in mind and also did not assay any of these susceptibility alleles. So it's an assumption that that's what the mechanism is. And there's another plausible hypothesis, which is that the association between these 2 biological parameters is mediated entirely through experience. And this would be true if being a person of recent African descent in a racially stratified society shapes the likelihood of exposure to social stressors rooted in systemic racism, then it could be that higher levels of African genetic ancestry could be associated with blood pressure purely through these sociocultural mechanisms, through the meaning that we ascribe to African ancestry, rather than to any functional genetic differences. As I was describing this to grad students several years ago, one of my then students, now professor at University of California, San Diego, Amy Nan, pointed out that the data set in question was publicly available. So she downloaded it, and she found that although there wasn't a robust set of variables to capture this experiential differences rooted in differential exposure to racism, there was a simple measure of educational opportunities, of educational attainment. And so we reran the analyses, first replicating what Teng and colleagues had reported, which is that when you control for age and sex and body mass index, there appears to be what they described as suggestive evidence of a positive association between African genetic ancestry and blood pressure, although you can see it doesn't reach conventional standards of statistical significance. But then if you include the education variables in the data set, we see that whatever scant evidence there had been for an ancestry effect dissipates. And instead, each additional year of education attained is associated with about 0.5 millimeter of mercury reduction in blood pressure. When you think about the difference then between completing high school or not starting it, or finishing college or not starting it, and you scale that up to the population level, we now begin to think about how this one simple variable captures significant differences in morbidity and risk of subsequent disease. So this suggests that we need to be paying attention to the social context and not defaulting to the assumption that when these differences exist, even when there are associations, apparent associations between genetic ancestry and some phenotype, we have to resist the default assumption that the mechanism is genetic. The mechanism could in fact be sociocultural. And so this leads us then to push for greater clarity in the concepts that we are invoking when the term race comes into play. Across disciplines, this varies quite a lot, where in some biomedical sciences, the concept of race is used and assumed to be related to some notion of genetic ancestry, whereas in the social sciences, we tend to think of race instead as a form of social classification based on the culturally defined meaning of race as an aspect of social status and rooted in a history of racialized oppression. So once we're clear about this conceptual difference, we can then try to develop measurement strategies that tease apart these different dimensions of the race concept. And that's the focus of the second study I'll share with you briefly from my work in the southeastern coast of Puerto Rico in the municipality of Guayama, which in the 1800s and 1800s was one of the major sugar producing regions of the island, and therefore had been a destination for many enslaved people from West Africa. Puerto Rico has the advantage of providing a different cultural context for the interpretation of phenotypic differences and different notions about genetic ancestry and even the concept of race. And the difference allows us to try to tease apart genetic ancestry from social classification in interesting ways. And the punchline from this work is that the social ascription of color, that is the everyday practice of defining somebody else's color or thinking about your own, is associated with blood pressure in our sample, but neither skin pigmentation nor genetic ancestry are. So to explain how I got to this point, I'll tell you just very briefly about some of the social sciencey stuff that I did to get started. We anthropologists often start our work just by living in a place and trying to experience it as much as possible as one would if you were from that context. We call this participant observation. So sometimes that involves just hanging out. So one day I was hanging out in a friend's shop, and I was asking questions about race, as probably a lot of naive North Americans had done before me arriving on the island. And she stopped me at some point and said, you know, you're asking all the wrong questions. Because, as she said here, here there are no divisions of raza, of race, but there are divisions of color. And without getting too deep into the weeds here, what she taught me in that moment was that the concept of raza, as most Puerto Ricans understand it, although it translates directly as race, actually has the opposite meaning. That in the North American concept of race connotes distinct, internally homogeneous groups. Whereas the concept of raza is actually a form of national identity that represents the mixture of European and Taino and African roots on the island, usually in that order. And then she set me out to understand what are the differences in terms of color? What are the categories that people use actually to classify themselves and others? And one snippet to illustrate some of these categories comes from a portion of the study in which I asked people to sort standardized facial portraits into whatever groups made sense to them. And what emerged from that in this aggregate representation produced with multidimensional scaling is 5 core categories that organize people's understanding of color. There's a sort of an axis from blanco or white to negro, black, that is bisected by these 3 intermediate categories of Trigueño, Indio, Negro, and Javao. And the lines that you see on the graph are from a regression-based technique that says that skin color and hair form explain most of the variance in people's perception of these categories. So if we think about this as sort of a cognitive map of color, we can see that it's not just about color, it's equally about hair texture, for example. Okay, it would be fair if you're wondering about the link to blood pressure at this point. So let me bring it back together, because what you notice here is that there are certain phenotypes of skin tone, for example, that could be placed into multiple social categories. So if you focus on the top portion of the graph, for example, you could see that people with darker skin tone could be perceived by others as Trigueño or as Indio or as Negro, depending on other physical features, not to mention other markers of social status like occupation, wealth, neighborhood of residence, and so forth. This then sets up that possibility that we could have, say, a fixed level of genetic ancestry or a fixed phenotype of skin pigmentation, where there might be variation in the social classification, which then enables us to pull those apart and say, well, which one is more predictive of, say, blood pressure variation? So this provides the basis then for a culturally grounded measure of that process of social classification, which is one of the exposures we have to get to. The other one that we have to get to is this notion of genetic ancestry. And so together with my colleague at the University of Florida, Dr. Connie Mulligan, we also assayed a set of ancestry informative markers, or AIMs. These are genetic variants that are purposely chosen to maximize variation in terms of people's putative continental ancestry. This is the kind of thing that the earlier study by Tang and colleagues glossed inappropriately, I think, as racial admixture. But it's that way of trying to get at some individual level measure of genetic ancestry. And then the third thing, which the study by Tang and colleagues did not do, was to try to look at some of the susceptibility alleles. So Connie Mulligan's lab, working with the Center for Pharmacogenomics at UF, assayed 6 polymorphisms in 3 genes of the adrenergic receptor family to see whether there might be any role for how our bodies respond to stress based on individual level genetic variation. So the first finding, which I show here, looks at the relationship between social classification and genetic ancestry. And in many ways, this plot confirms the basic critique of the race concept by showing us that socially constructed categories like color in Puerto Rico or race in the mainland US are not good predictors of genetic difference, even when the measure of genetic difference is a set of markers that have been chosen to maximize the difference. These are markers that have large frequency differences between putative ancestral populations. So you can see, as you might expect, as you go from blanco to trigueño to negro, that there's a general trend of higher levels of African ancestry. But I think more pertinent is the amount of overlap. and that there are some levels of African ancestry here where people could be placed into any one of these categories. So it raises question about what are we actually getting at when we talk about race or color. And it also sets up, again, this idea of, well, if you look at, say, that 40% level of African ancestry and see that people could be classified as into any one of these categories, which one is a better predictor of blood pressure? And the answer is that it's color and class, the social dimensions of color and class, not genetic ancestry, that predicts blood pressure in our sample. So first, we ignored the data that we had about color and class and just looked at African ancestry and then a set of standard covariates, age, sex, body mass index, and antihypertensive medication. And we actually appear to produce stronger evidence than the Tang study did, for example, of a positive association between African ancestry and blood pressure. But that is an artifact of ignoring the way that color and class shape people's experience, their exposure to stress, and other possible toxic insults. Because when we include our culturally grounded measure of color, this aspect of social classification, as well as a measure of socioeconomic status, and the interaction between them, we see that it's really the interaction between class and color that has the most explanatory power. And again, the evidence for an ancestry effect dissipates. This is a visualization of that interaction in the full model. And it shows us that for people who are perceived by others as blanco or trigueño, as white, or trigueño is this intermediate category that literally means wheat-colored, that as socioeconomic status increases, blood pressure decreases, which is the pattern that we're used to seeing in the industrialized world. But for people who were perceived by other Puerto Ricans as negro or black, that blood pressure increases along with socioeconomic status. Now, I wouldn't fixate too much on the slope of these lines. You notice the error bars are pretty wide. So for example, that the line for people who are classified as negro may not, the real line may not be quite as steep as it is. Nevertheless, there's something going on here, and it's hard to know exactly what. But this pattern is consistent with a model of the social stress process, because one possible interpretation that's also consistent with what we know about the experience of inequality in Puerto Rico is that as one climbs the social ladder, the salience of color increases. To put it another way, the people who are in the upper right-hand quadrant of this plot could effectively be negros living in a world of blancos. They are moving in social circles, living in neighborhoods, working in professions that have historically been dominated by light-skinned Puerto Ricans as a manifestation of white supremacy. And this feeling of being out of place could very well mean greater levels of exposure to frustrating, discriminatory interactions and encounters with institutional racism as well. And that rough idea is also consistent with the way people simply talk about racism in their everyday lives. So for example, when I asked my landlord one day to tell me how she thought about these issues and how she thought about racism in everyday life, she said, you don't see it much among the poor, but among those who are better off economically, you see a lot of racism because they often reject people beneath them. And just a quick aside, subsequent to this study, another group of researchers analyzed data from the Cardia study and showed the same kind of interaction between class and skin color for African Americans in the US, where for light-skinned African Americans, higher levels of household income were associated with lower blood pressure. But for dark-skinned African Americans, it's basically a flat line, that the health benefits of higher income did not accrue to darker-skinned African Americans in the same way it did to lighter-skinned African Americans. So there's probably something going on here that transcends cultural context. Now, before I leave this example, I want to make sure that I disabuse you of the idea that I'm making a simple argument that nurture trumps nature, full stop. What I'm arguing instead is that if we want to understand the way biology works, then we have to dispense with race as a proxy for genetic differences. And we have to think about race instead as an aspect of the environment that shapes our biology. And in fact, that when we do so, it will improve our ability to understand the genetic basis of complex phenotypes like blood pressure. Because we found that when we ignored the sociocultural data on class and color, that none of the candidate genes for hypertension that we looked at showed evidence of being associated with blood pressure. Instead, all of the explanatory power rested with the African ancestry variable. But again, that was true only if we ignored the data we had based on class and color, because when we included class and color and the interaction between them again, then we saw that, again, the ancestry effect goes away. The interaction between class and color is substantial and significant. And it reveals an association between one of the polymorphisms and blood pressure that had been masked when we ignored the sociocultural data. And I think a simple way to think about this is that if phenotype is the product of genotype and environment, then the better job we do of capturing relevant parts of the environment, the more power we will have to detect the way that genes also matter at the individual level. And we lost this in the earlier analysis where we ignored the sociocultural dimensions of class and color, and we saw it only once we took that into account. And I think that the important takeaway there is that, yeah, genes can still matter at the individual level in terms of our risk. Our family histories matter. It's that by and large, the genetic basis of complex phenotypes is not distributed in color-coded boxes. And that's where we will be led astray if we assume that categories like race are sufficient proxies for those differences. Okay, so I want to wrap up by taking you from the work in Puerto Rico to my more recent work in a very exotic place for an anthropologist to work, Tallahassee, Florida, a couple hours down the road from where I am at the University of Florida. First of all, I want you to set aside any conceptions you have about Florida. Tallahassee is known more for moss-covered oak trees rather than sun-kissed palms. And it's just far enough north to be part of the Deep South. In fact, a few people realize that Tallahassee was the site of only the third bus boycott in 1956 after Selma and Montgomery. And by many accounts, it was the most successful of the three. And the spirit of civil rights activism evident in 1956 remains alive and well in Tallahassee in a way that distinguishes it from the rest of Florida. In the 15 years or so that I've been working in Tallahassee, there have been countless occasions like this one where the city is shut down in protest of racial injustice, whereas while elsewhere in Florida, you might hardly hear a peep about it. So it's also in this context that a Tallahassee born and raised community organizer named Miss Maisha Mitchell and I co-founded HEAT, the Health Equity Alliance of Tallahassee, which is grounded in principles of community-based participatory research with a goal of building equitable partnerships between university researchers, community members, and policymakers to bridge the gap between research and action for health equity. Our central focus is to explain and eliminate social inequalities in health with particular attention to the health consequences of systemic racism. And one of our signature projects is an ethnographic and small community-based epidemiological study that we refer to as HEAT Heart Health. This is a two-phase study that began with ethnography to try to understand the way that people experience stress in their everyday lives so that we could build culturally salient measures of social stressors for use in the epidemiological survey, which used a multi-stage probability sample of African Americans between 25 and 65 years old, in which we measured a range of health outcomes and social stressors, expanded the range of biomarkers and genetic analyses, and so forth. This work, as is consistent with the principles of CBPR was a collaboration with a community steering committee that included Ms. Mitchell, the co-founder of HEAT, but also 4 other local residents and activists who were and are part of this process from conception to dissemination. So there are a lot of moving parts to this study that I won't be able to tell you about, but I'll focus on just one finding that emerged that that I think represents an underappreciated contributor to racial inequalities in blood pressure and heart disease and other stress-related outcomes. And that's the concept of vicarious racism, which refers to the secondary experience of interpersonal and institutional racism through the actions, feelings, and experiences of others rather than through direct experience. And I would argue that vicarious racism is a potentially important but overlooked contributor to racial inequalities in health. To give you a sense of how we came upon this concept, it started by just collecting people's stories about how they experience race and racism in everyday life. And I'll share with you one example from an interview with a 21-year-old woman who had a high school education and worked as a secretary. And at one point in the interview, she said that some white people try to get under your skin so you can argue with them. Like, for instance, one of my coworkers had some long braids in her hair, so this white nurse pulls up a picture of a Doberman dog on her computer and tells her, "Oh, this is what you look like," to her face. And I'm the type of person, I'm sorry, if you're talking about her, you're talking about me because she's Black. This dehumanizing episode is salient for giving a sense of how people might experience everyday racism in the workplace and in mundane social interaction. And what's particularly striking about it here is the way that this woman empathizes with her coworker's experience and takes it on as her own because of a shared racial identity. The implication of her comment, if you talk about her, you're talking about me, is that she may experience any episode of racism in a personal way, even if she's not the direct target or victim of that episode. And I think probably all of us can relate to this. Maybe not if you're racialized as white like me, it's not a matter of racial discrimination, but certainly I can think about if something bad happens to one of my loved ones, it's still going to affect me. And maybe in ways that would be even harder to deal with than if it happened to me directly. So I think thinking about the social context, the relational context of people's experience of racism-related stressors is something that we need to pay attention to, and we haven't. Because the most widely used instruments for assessing exposure to discrimination focus on the individual in isolation. The most widely used measure, developed by the sociologist David Williams at Harvard, asks people if they have ever been treated unfairly in a range of social domains, including police, courts, employment, education, housing, and so forth. Based on the stories that people were telling us about their experiences of race and racism, where it was often not about what had happened to them, but instead things that had happened to their friends or loved ones, we made a simple tweak to this scale. And we asked people, have you or someone close to you ever been treated unfairly in any of these domains? Overall, about 80% of people answered in the affirmative, but the pattern of responses was surprising. Here you see the cross-tabulation, the percentage of participants reporting both direct and vicarious discrimination. That's represented by the upper right-hand quadrant. So more than half of people reported both things. Only one or the other, or denying the experience of either one. So overall, more participants reported vicarious racism than they did direct discrimination, 73% versus 61%. And as I say, the majority of participants reported experiencing both direct and vicarious discrimination. But the crucial finding, in my view, is that over 20% of the participants in our survey reported vicarious discrimination in the absence of direct discrimination. That is to say, they denied that they had ever been treated unfairly in any of the situations that we presented, but they reported that someone close to them had been. This group of people in standard epidemiological studies would be classified as unexposed to discrimination, suggesting that overall the literature, the robust literature on the health consequences of discrimination may be biased toward the null, because we're missing, in this case, a fifth of the sample of people who reported exposure to this stressful experience, but would not have been captured with standard measures of discrimination. And just to give you a sense of how this might play out, here I'm showing differences between gender differences in the experience of direct versus vicarious discrimination. Direct discrimination on the left, vicarious on the right, looking at the sources, the social domains in which people reported having these exposures. And I'll draw attention to one component of this in particular, which is that for women in our survey, direct discrimination in encounters with police was the least common exposure that they had. Only 4.8% of women reported that direct experience of unfair treatment with police. But if you look at vicarious discrimination, you can see it jumps to be the second most common kind of discrimination they experience, with 15% of women reporting that exposure. And certainly, this is a meaningful part of people's experience, their encounters with systemic racism, that could have consequences for how our bodies work. And in fact, we looked at this new measure of vicarious discrimination in association with different genetic loci, and saw, NPR put this a little more simply, that knowing someone who faced discrimination may affect blood pressure, not just experiencing yourself. And beyond that, what's really intriguing is that the pattern of findings suggests that vicarious discrimination may affect blood pressure through a different biological pathway than does direct discrimination. So here you're seeing systolic blood pressure on the left, diastolic blood pressure on the right. And from the genome-wide SNPs, you can see that in the top boxes, where we're looking at direct discrimination to self, that there was one significant interaction with a SNP that had previously been identified as associated with serum cholesterol in African Americans. In the case of vicarious discrimination, shown in the bottom panels, what you see for systolic blood pressure instead is a significant interaction with 3 SNPs that had never been associated with any cardiovascular outcome, but had been associated with suicidal ideation, psychological distress, and mood disorders. So it suggests that there could be different ways that our bodies are responding to these different dimensions of discrimination. And of course, if we zoomed out from beyond people's immediate social networks, their close friends and family and loved ones, we could imagine how the range of exposures that people face again draws our attention to the way that we are likely underestimating the exposures to discrimination and the health consequences that result. We could also place this into a broader conceptual frame, as I attempted to do in this paper early on in the pandemic, thinking about the specific components of systemic racism that shape the social environment and that create pathways for cardiometabolic disease, but also exposure to SARS-CoV-2, and then to the possible biological interactions among these disease states. Thinking as well about the positive feedback relationships where the social and economic consequences of the pandemic may exacerbate the prior social inequalities, say in unemployment, in housing, in educational opportunities, that had already led to baseline racialized inequalities in cardiometabolic outcomes. So I'll end by just reconsidering this question from Scientific American. I said at the beginning that this question falters because it can be interpreted in different ways, and that people understand race to mean different things. And so researchers and practitioners in different disciplines often talk past one another. About 15 years ago, almost 20 years ago now, the anthropologists Ken Weiss and Stephanie Fullerton summarized the situation with a fitting metaphor. The issue of race, they said, continues to cycle endlessly like blinkered horses in old country fair merry-go-rounds, oblivious to the fact they're just going round and round. And if you look at the history of debates about race in medicine and public health, you can definitely start to feel dizzy. So how do we stop the spinning? One basic step forward, I'm arguing, is to recognize that researchers and practitioners use race to mean different things, and the failure to specify what we mean is a major barrier to progress. So when some researchers talk about race, they mean genetic ancestry. Social scientists are more likely to understand race as a form of social classification, and the failure to distinguish between these, operationalize those concepts in different ways, leads to misunderstanding. So we can take away from this reminders that the concept of race is a poor proxy for the structure of human genetic variation, whereas systemic racism has biological consequences, and the embodied inequalities that are a consequence of systemic inequality can reinforce false ideas about intrinsic differences in race, genes, and disease. All right, thank you very much. I look forward to some questions in the time we have left. Yeah.
Well, thank you. That was wonderful.
Much needed discussion, I think. I'm in the midst of reading a book, so this is very pertinent for me, which is called Fatal Invention, which I would recommend to anyone who wants to kind of explore, if you would agree.
As I would, absolutely. Dorothy Roberts' work is fabulous.
Really wonderful book, about 100+ pages into it. So what I'm going to ask relates to how we as clinicians and investigators define evidence in how we practice and how we utilize the evidence that is created. And it relates to how we are now required in our grant submissions and in our presentary work to talk about and define in structured ways race, ethnicity, components that have been institutionalized through NIH and through other forms. And I think it dates back to, I want to say 2003 or 96, I can't remember when that was required. And it was kind of, I've been told, added as a last minute joiner to a bill, and now we are presenting that in our papers, and so I'd like to get your sense of what you think about that, recognizing that it may, race as we define it, particularly in the US, may be related to geographic ancestry. And even that's kind of iffy, I think, right? And whether there's value added. And then maybe a comment for you to reflect on is, many of us came back from the American Heart Association this past weekend, and I had a pleasure of presenting one of our trial program that I worked on for nearly a decade, where we self-congratulated ourselves and others congratulated us because we were able to enroll 40% self-identified African Americans in a population of heart failure over 3,000 patients. And I wonder if that grouping actually means anything other than a description of a either political or sociological construct, although because it was related to diuretics used commonly in heart failure, many people are identifying, imprinting some biological phenomenon to that. And we're kind of stuck with the reality that we wanted to increase our participation, but how do we interpret it? I don't really know. So a lot there, sorry about that.
There was a lot there, and really rich. So I appreciate all of it very much. So the first question that you asked is about this problem of being forced to report using the federal government's categories, which were defined in Office of Management and Budget Directive 15, initially back in the 1970s. And what happens when those categories become a routine part of the conduct of biomedical science? So the first thing I'll say about that is that Dorothy Roberts, the author of Fatal Invention, and I are among 17 members of a National Academy of Medicine committee that's focused on the use of race, ethnicity, and ancestry in genetic and genomic research. And our final report arrived in my inbox last night. It's going to be published in February. And I will say that we address this issue about what to do with OMB categories head on. Speaking as an individual, not as a member of that committee, I would say that it's important that you linked it to Dorothy Roberts' work in Fatal Invention, because she's very clear that what race is a political project. And the OMB categories make that plain, because the reason those categories exist is to ensure equal access to opportunities our society ought to provide. And that would include the benefits of medical research. So it would be a problem if researchers didn't think about constructing cohorts that somehow looked like the whole country, right? Which of course has been the historical fact. So it is something to congratulate you and your colleagues on, that you've enrolled 40% of the cohort of people who identify themselves as Black. The problem is how we interpret those categories, because if we understand them correctly, those are political categories. If you get NIH funding, you should report on that as a way of ensuring that you're conducting research with an eye toward equity. But you should not be interpreting those categories as proxies for genetic susceptibility to disease or anything about the way people's bodies work in any sort of intrinsic way. And so I think distinguishing between the political uses of those categories on an NIH application and OMB and the census and so forth, from the kinds of concepts that we would use in science, that's a very important thing. So, and this relates then, I think, to the question about trials and how do we interpret this. And it, I think, also brings us back to the JNC guidelines, which are also treating Black and non-Black as meaningful categories without defining what they are or providing clinicians with any guidance about how are you supposed to determine it. The main study on which these guidelines were based, the All-Hat trial, was also conducted not just in the mainland US, but also in Canada and Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, places where, as I've just discussed, the notion of Black plays out in very different ways, very different histories of settler colonialism. And so the idea that we could sort of impose this as sort of universal categories is troubling. The other thing that happens there is this imposition of categorical thinking. So it sounds like there are two categories of humans, according to JNC guidelines. We have Black and non-Black populations, and it's based on the All-Hat trial, which showed that ACE inhibitors were associated with a lower mean reduction in blood pressure for people who identified as Black than for people who identified in any other way. The problem is that it's not a categorical phenotype. It's a continuous phenotype. So if you actually if you look at the JAMA article about the All-Hat trial, this Wright and colleagues 2005, and you look at the mean and the standard deviation that they report in their tables there, what I've done here is I've just taken, I've assumed a normal distribution for the reported means and standard deviations. And the mean difference is 5.2 millimeters of mercury difference in the reduction of blood pressure, right? But look at those standard deviations. The standard deviations are 20 for people racialized as white and 22.4 for those racialized as Black. So if you look at it at an individual level, these distributions are almost completely overlapping. So if we interpret this mean difference of 5 millimeters of mercury as if we can discriminate between Black and non-Black patients in the choice of antihypertensive therapy, and yet those curves are almost entirely overlapping, we're very likely to make mistakes if we're basing our recommendations on this supposed categorical difference. So I feel like, and I don't know if this is happening in the cardiology world, but I feel like these recommendations deserve the same kind of scrutiny that race correction and EGFR equations has gotten in that sort of thing, because the evidence base is actually quite weak.
I think Arya has a question from the chat. Arya, go ahead.
Phenomenal presentation. I really enjoyed it as one of the strongest grand rounds I have heard. I'm a geneticist, so I want to start first by saying that I completely agree with you that concluding for a complex trait that actually is a result of interaction of environment and gene, that gene plays a major role for higher prevalence of hypertension among some ethnicity and not others, is wrong. And it is much more complex than one can conclude from that. And also race being actually a basis for genetic determination is also a wrong approach. However, I want to actually clarify here one point, and that is that genetic variation obviously is different between one ethnicity and to another, and may actually cause a different mechanism of disease. I'm not saying that the environment and poverty and all those things may not play a greater role than the genetics. It depends obviously on the impact of that variant. But there is a difference, and studying that in different ethnicities may actually lead to identification of different targets planned for the improvement of the therapy of hypertension. So I think there are differences. I mean, for example, ApoL1 is a variant that is more common among African American for focal glomerulosclerosis. So that is more causing that disease, that variant. So practically just including all these ethnicities in our studies and looking at the relationship, having eyes obviously on the impact of the poverty and discrimination on it is important. And maybe Mendelian randomization of looking at the mental stress variants and see if there is any co-localization with the hypertension loci, especially mental stress is kind of a consequence of the racism. So would be also important to consider.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that clarification, and I agree with you that what matters is specifying hypotheses and testing alternative explanations. So the pattern that I find so problematic is when race is imposed as a proxy for genetic variation without any genetic data. It's the assumption that it captures genetic differences. So if my take on this, and I think you and I are sort of coming from the same place, would be if you have a genetic hypothesis, then you have to collect some genetic data. You have to actually examine the structure of human genetic variation. And in addition, you should be in a position to test competing hypotheses by carefully trying to measure aspects of the social environment that also contribute to that phenotype and looking at the sorts of interactions that occur. Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, I think we have time for one last question, or I'm going to make the executive decision that we do. So, Erica.
Thanks. This was a really fabulous talk, and I think gets to the heart of what we are struggling with in science, which is that so much of our data and so many of our risk scores embed race as a categorical variable that concedes risk, but is carrying so many other factors. And so when we apply that broadly, we get into a very worrisome scenario of under or overestimating risk and really not understanding what's behind that and maybe applying the wrong solution to what that increased risk is. One additional thing that I wondered if you could comment on is not just the racialized experiences of our patients, but also what we as healthcare practitioners bring in terms of our own bias. One of our fellows, Andi Shahu, looked at the All-Hat study and found that there was differential blood pressure achievement based on which study site you were enrolled in. And so when you look at the study sites, oh, thank you. That's a thank you, sir. This was, he spent a year with us as a Yale medical student, and this was the core of his thesis, looking at the concentration of study sites in the Deep South and the fact that African Americans were more likely to attend those sites. So the results are really conflated. And when you look at like what the, the ALLHAT study preferenced which medications to start with, but didn't say what to do after that. And so there's like widespread disparities in how people were treated for blood pressure as well. So, when we think about our role as, in this world, I think that adds additional complexity.
Absolutely. I love this paper, and it was in the talk before I realized that you all were all from here. You're the Erica that's also a co-author in this paper, is that right? Okay. Yeah, no, thank you for this work. It's so important. Actually, as I was preparing the talk, I had to go back to February of 2021. I got into a Twitter spat where I would use this as evidence to try to stir up trouble about this. Yeah, this is such an important finding because, as you all argue in this paper, it's in the context of a clinical trial where there's a standardized protocol where you're supposed to be leveling the differences. And yet, because of the spatial and socioeconomic stratification, the way that race operates as a structure, not just as an individual interaction, you all have this amazing finding that if you set up the counties where these clinical sites occurred and you break them into these quintiles based on median household income, look at the racial composition of the counties surrounding the clinical sites, where in the lowest quintile, 70% of the trial participants identified as Black, and only about 10% as white. And the blue bars, which represent people who identified themselves as Black, steadily decrease as you get to higher income areas. And the darker gray bars, which represent people who identified as white, increases, right? So you have this, the socioeconomic stratification is completely racialized, so that then when it gets down to how that structures the clinical outcomes, it really does leave you sort of scratching your head about, well, what do we do with ALLHAT then? Because already that 5.2 millimeter mercury difference in the 4-year decrease is problematic because of the overlapping distributions. But then when you also think about, well, yeah, but also it wasn't just which drug they got randomized to, that there are all of these contextual effects. This, I think, needs to be part of the re-examination of the evidence base for these clinical recommendations. And I think it's what I want to really draw out of your questions, when we think about what researchers and clinicians bring to it, it's not just what we bring in sort of interacting with patients, say, for example, which is an important piece of it, but also how we read the medical literature, how we interpret these guidelines, where we put the emphasis. Why does the JNC talk about Black and non-Black populations and not poor and wealthy ones, for example? So yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, and that sort of gets to that third key takeaway that I was talking about, the way that these embodied inequalities can reinforce our prior conception that what matters is race. There's a lot of circular logic that goes on in that thinking. So thank you for your work.
Thank you so much, Lance. Oh, sorry. Thank you so much, Lance, for that really, really wonderful talk. And thank you to everyone who attended both in person and on the Zoom.
Thank you all.